Hello, I'm Kevin Harris and welcome to our live show. Joining me here today we have Paul Champlina from Landlord Action and Eddie Hugger from Total Landlord Insurance. And joining us later on as well will be Simon Thompson from Accommodation for Students and Vanessa Warwick from Property Tribes. We'll be here bringing you the latest property tweets of the week. Gents, thanks for joining us first up. Good evening. And thanks to you for joining us wherever you are as well. And don't forget, of course, if you've not seen the show before, let me quickly remind you how things are going to work today. First up then, our experts will offer their top tips on how to deal with nightmare tenants. We'll prepare you with everything that you need to know about letting your property out to students. We'll also be hearing advice from an expert on finding the right tenant. And there'll be those tweets of the week, and of course we'll be answering all of your questions live. And don't forget, if you do have any questions, we would love to hear from you. Just use the box that's on your screen right now, or of course you can get in touch via Twitter. And if you do, please just add a hashtag to your tweet, and that hashtag then is hashtag #LetYourPropertyTV, and we'll do our best to give you a mention. So Paul, Eddie, thanks for joining us. Paul, we'll start with you perhaps first. Nightmare tenants, they must be a landlord's kind of like, you know, just no-go, but what sort of problems can they bring for a landlord?
They can bring a lot of problems. At the moment, there was a recent survey that came out that over 100,000 tenants in this country are more than 2 months in rent arrears.
That's incredible.
It's incredible. And as this buy-to-let boom in the last 10 years has expanded, we're now at 16.6%, predicted to go to the year 2020 to 23%. There's going to be more bad tenants. There's more landlords coming to the market. There's a lack, obviously, of building out there. There's job losses. There's a whole stream of reasons why there's problem tenants, and it's about, if you do have a problem tenant, it's how do you react and how do you deal with it quickly. Yeah,
and exactly. I suppose before you get to that point, though, I mean, could you flag up a troublesome tenant early on, you know, before they even, you know, you take them on?
Well, I can, kind of.
Right, okay.
That's with that's dealing with over 23,000 instructions in the last 12 years. Obviously, it's down to the referencing, which is paramount. But you know, from dealing, you know, we're running hundreds of cases at a time, and every case is different, and every landlord and agent are different. The problem that you have is that you have a landlord that may be worrying about voids and sticking a tenant in the property as quickly as possible. One about the mortgage being paid. They're accidental landlords. And, you know, it's like anything. If you sign a credit agreement for buy a sofa, you're going to be credit checked. It's exactly the same when you're given a 30 days credit with a tenancy agreement because it's an advance. You've got to carry out your checking. If you don't do that, then get a professional that does it for you.
I think it is inexperience as well by a lot of landlords, because the accidental landlord boom is rising as well.
And when you say accidental landlord, you mean somebody who's got a bit of spare cash, they think, you know, I'll downsize and use that money for another property, or and maybe become a landlord. Or
has been left a property, or even people that bought in, you know, in the 2003, 2004, 2005 era, that were looking to buy a property, flip it, not being interested in being a landlord, and then ended up getting stuck with a property. But you know, but being a landlord is a good business. Let's face it. I mean, I know there was a recent survey done about 7 or 8 months ago by Halifax, of which 3,000 tenants were interviewed and asked if they wanted to buy, if they wanted to be, you know, homeowners. 95% of them said they couldn't afford for a deposit. So we've now got another generation of renters, exactly like we have in Europe, in terms of Germany and France.
Yeah, France, for example, most people rent there rather than buy, don't they?
Yeah, it's massive.
You know, so what can we do, or what, you know, the accidental landlord, or indeed landlords in general, what can they do not only to protect perhaps, you know, the physical aspects of their property, but then also against like loss of income? If people are 2 months in arrears, there's 2 months where they've got to cover the mortgage themselves, or
well, they've got to be geared up and think worst case scenario.
Right.
We tell it how it is. We're like at Landlord Action. We're like landlord Samaritans.
Okay,
so what we say is it could be worst case scenario. You could have your tenant in the property for 5 years. 5 months. Sorry, that is a long time. So as soon as there's 2 months rent arrears, you serve your Section 8, your rent arrears notice. Then you're going to court, and then obviously you'll arrange to get your bailiffs in. So it's being able to cope with those financial losses, paying the mortgage, and paying the illegal fees, and being geared up. I mean, I would say last year was the biggest amount of landlords that I know of in our history of having their properties repossessed. At the same time, we're trying to evict their tenants. And they're the accidental landlords that don't have a B plan.
And also, I think a lot of landlords don't know what to do.
No, exactly.
When they end up with a problem, they either bury their head in the sand, or they try to negotiate with their tenant.
And tenants will pull the wool over their eyes. I mean, we had one landlord. We had one landlord who called us about 5 months ago. He had 13 months rent arrears. He was an overseas landlord. didn't have a proper managing agent, you know. And of course, another preventive action is obviously taking insurance.
Yeah, of
course. You know, which is rental guarantee insurance.
That's what I was just going to say to you. What, you know, what can you do to protect yourself financially?
Well, you can buy rent guarantee insurance, which is a policy which will provide you for protection if the tenant stops paying their rent. There's terms and conditions like with all insurance policies, so I always suggest make sure you read the small print and know what you're buying. But you can pick up these sort of policies for, you know, around about £100 per year, and that will provide you up to £25,000 worth of loss of rent. The problem being with these type of policies is that you have to follow the protocols.
Right.
So as Paul says, if you get into 1 month's rent or 2 months' rent arrears, and you have to write letters, and the insurance company
You've got to show the insurance company you've been doing something along the way.
Or you need to talk to your insurance and they take it over for you.
We have that because we act for insurance companies as well, but we find there's a lot of landlords that are able to carry out the procedure themselves and are able to do that, but there's a lot of landlords that just don't have a clue. And the advice that I do when I do talks all over the country is as soon as there's one month and 1 day in arrears, which effectively is 2 months rent arrears, you should be serving that notice. In that meantime, you should be communicating, you should be sending your letters, you should be getting that gut feeling as to whether you're... I always say give your tenant a chance.
Yes.
You know, and if they're not giving that chance, or they are burying their head in the sand, which Eddie said, then you have to take a commercial view, because this game is a commercial business.
Absolutely. And then there must, like, I mean, you mentioned your overseas guy there with 13 months rent arrears. He should have done something much sooner.
He didn't check his bank statement.
Well, exactly. He's got, you know, that's kind of incredible. I mean, maybe he's got so much money it doesn't matter. Who knows?
I think a deposit, deposits are very, very important.
Yeah.
So take at least 1 month's deposit from your tenant, because if they do fall into rent arrears, as Paul says, for maybe 1 or 2 months, at least you've covered some of that. And tenant referencing as well.
Referencing is paramount.
Yeah, make sure that you know who the tenant is and you're doing the checks on them.
I mean, I
would get more than one reference, presumably.
I mean, it's time. So if you don't have the time, you get a proper qualified accredited tenant referencing company, or I would say get 3 months bank statements. You'll see what day of the month the tenant gets paid, how much they get paid, what are their other exes. I mean, a bank statement tells you everything. If a tenant would generally turn around and say to you, I'm not giving you that bank statement, then what are they hiding? That's normally an indication. Then you've got employer's reference. You'll see whether, if you have their bank statements, if their wages going in, is it, you know, are they working for Marks and Spencers? Is a direct debit going in? Previous landlord's reference, which we're finding is a big problem, because we actually have tenants that are actually in rent arrears with a previous landlord, and they say they're a good tenant, they want to pass the problem on. And we're seeing a huge rise of that type of situation.
What about cash, Paul? If a tenant says to you, I'll pay you by cash, that would be alarm bells, wouldn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, generally we've seen a lot of that with regard to cannabis factories. Dare I say it's a growing industry, but excuse the pun. But we are seeing a lot of landlords that are really worried, and they're cutting. You know, there should be a procedure that you follow with regard to referencing. And if you're taking away some of that that referencing procedure, and they're saying we give you 6 months rent in advance, but I'm not going to give you a bank statement. You know, there's a lot of ID theft out there. And then, you know, the telltale signs obviously with the cannabis factory is that, you know, there's no one's living there. The windows are all blacked out. The letterbox is sealed.
Big claims.
And it's big claims.
Now there must be a point though when you just think to yourself, well, hold it. Look, I've gone through the process. I'm in rent arrears. It's unresolved. I need them out. I've got to evict them.
Well, you do, and that's where you serve your notice.
When do you get to that point, and what do you do?
Well, so when there's 2 months rent arrears, in that meantime, you've tried to chase. You've given your tenant a chance. You serve your notice, and then you have to apply to issue court proceedings, which will take you 6 to 8 weeks to go before the judge. If you're successful, which is what you want to be, you'll get a 14-day possession order, you'll get a money order, you'll get some costs, and after that, if the tenant still doesn't leave and is still obstinate, then you've got to get the bailiffs in to do the eviction. Now, bailiffs are busier than ever, as you can imagine. They're doing house repossessions, they're doing landlord and tenant evictions, they're trying to collect debts. The whole process from start to finish can be about 4 to 5 months, depending on the court you're at. And then
and you've still got to pay the mortgage. And
you've still got to pay the mortgage and your legal fees and your maintenance charges on the block. And then really you have to say to yourself, and I say this to all my landlords, take a commercial view, is that tenant worth pursuing? If they're on housing benefit, or you open the door after the eviction and there's low amount of post, everyone's chasing your tenant, you've got no chance. I'd rather you spend your 500-600 quid it is to do a debt recovery procedure in, you know, employing a maintenance guy, get the property up to a lettable state and try and reclaim. And learn by your mistakes. Every landlord will make a mistake.
Well, hold that thought, because actually I think we can have a look now at yourself in action, Paul, on an eviction that you took part in recently. Have a look at this.
Thanks. this place is being sold by all accounts, so it's important that we get vacant possession. I think there's only 2 tenants left. We're doing an eviction of one of these tenants today, and we're waiting for the bailiffs in about 10 minutes. Most of the time you open the door, there's no one there, okay, we have to change the locks, and then there's a whole pile of post on the floor, and you know that, and then you open the fridge and there's some stale milk, and you know they've been there 2 or 3 days beforehand. They've packed up most of the time, but you do have the occasional tenant like today where they're still in the property. The tenant's now gone. Good as gold, no problem at all. He's okay, he's very calm. He's actually eating a kebab from last night for breakfast, so I don't think that tastes that nice. So police came just to make sure they oversee everything. They were here for 1 second and went off. Bailiff's gone to do another job. Once Gareth puts that shutter up, secures it, we've got one more to go. It's, you know, it's a little bit relentless. For the year 2020, we're looking at 23% of the housing market is going to be private rental sector. At the moment, it's 15%. I can tell you now that the last quarter, there was over 100,000 tenants in more than 2 months' rent arrears. So, you know, we are going to get busier. There is more landlords out there, there's more bad tenants, but people can't buy properties. You know, they're struggling to buy.
There you go, interesting stuff. You remember that one, Paul?
I do actually, yeah.
I do. One you'd rather forget.
Well, no, I've just, you know, I tend to do it, I tend to do it more for the cameras now than I used to, but I've seen some very classical works of art left on people's walls.
Well, yeah, I can imagine. I was just going to say, you know, Eddie, malicious damage must be a landlord's worst nightmare, but I think, you know, you've got some, you know, Total Insurance has got some stats on that recently.
Well, we've done quite a few surveys over the past few months, especially with regard to frequencies and values of claims. And malicious damage is right up there in terms of not only the cost of it, but the aggravation of it. And you know, our advice is make sure that you've got an insurance policy that actually covers malicious damage, because a lot of them don't cover malicious damage.
We had one landlord in Scotland that we assisted many moons ago. He didn't have malicious. He had a cannabis factory, and it cost him, I think, in the tune of about £12,000–13,000.
No way.
And it puts landlords off being landlords. Yeah, it's a massive hit.
Yeah, and that could potentially be your mortgage payments for the whole year.
Exactly.
So anything that you
have a look at the small print of the policy, because many policies will not cover malicious damage whilst the property is unoccupied after a certain amount of time.
Right, okay.
And especially, when we'll talk about it later, with student lets, where you end up with maybe 2 or 3 months of the year where the property is unoccupied because the student's gone back home. That's when malicious damage happens. The property's empty, in go
and the landlord hasn't done enough to secure or see that property.
Exactly.
All right, chaps, well, we'll leave it there for a moment. Paul actually will say goodbye to you for now.
You're welcome.
Thanks for your company. Thanks for your input. Eddie, you're staying right where you are.
Thank you.
We're moving on now, and it's time for our Ask the Experts feature, and we grabbed some time with James Davis from UPAD and asked his advice on how to find a good tenant, and here's what he had to say.
Before taking on a tenant, I think it's very important you do your due diligence on them and who they are as a person. I'm a self-managing landlord, which means that I do all the viewings myself. I manage the property throughout the course of the tenancy agreement. And I think the first thing to do is and what I recommend landlords do, is do the viewings themselves. The gut feel of meeting somebody, it's very hard to put your finger on it, but I think it's imperative that you do that. Sort of looking somebody in the eye, I think, says a huge amount about who they actually are. You can ask them questions like, when would you want to move into the property? If they say, oh, next week's okay, it's, well, have they actually given notice to their existing landlord, for example, because they've got to give notice? What that will flag up in your mind is whether they're going to do a runner from you in 11 months' time, for example, without giving you the correct notices. Anecdotally, various things I've heard from colleagues of mine is, you know, what car did they turn up in? You know, was it full of crisp packets and rubbish in the car? Because it's probably an indication that your property in 12 months' time will look in a similar sort of state. And I think the other thing worth mentioning is you might want to go 2 landlords back for a reference, because if you had a problem tenant and you were asked from a reference, you'd probably give a shining example of how great they've been, because you want them out of your property as quickly as you can. To overcome that, you may want to go 2 back to completely protect yourselves. But at the end of the day, for the majority of landlords, owning a buy-to-let or a portfolio of properties is your pension fund. It'd be very easy just to take the first person that comes along without doing your checks and end up with a tenant in arrears for 6 months, potentially damaging the property and you having to sort that mess out with the costs and the effort associated with it. A lot of that pain can be alleviated by physically meeting a tenant and also fully referencing them. There's a lot of other tips that we've got on our blog, which is at upad.co.uk, and on there is a lot of advice and top tips about how you can maximise yields, minimise voids, and ensure you're getting the best possible tenants along. But I think those in a nutshell are my sort of key takeaways that I think would be good for landlords to know.
So, welcome back, and I'm pleased to say that we're now joined here in the studio by Simon Thompson from Accommodation for Students and Vanessa White from Property Tribes, who will be bringing us our tweets of the week shortly. We were just all watching, thanks for coming in by the way guys, we were all just having a little watch of James there from UPAD, and I think Simon, you're kind of quite interested in that one.
It's quite entertaining, as you mentioned about the crisp packets, and there's one thing about students is you're pretty much guaranteed to find crisp packets in the cars.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, letting to students, I suppose, is obviously your specialty here. Very different to letting to just any regular sort of like professionals.
That's right. There aren't too many key differences.
Not that there's anything wrong with students, I might add as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Important to make note. Yeah. There aren't too many differences as such, but obviously with students, you've got a 40-week tenancy as a minimum tenancy term.
Okay.
And you generally, students do rent in houses of multiple occupation as well, so generally you've got more tenants than you have with a professional let.
Yeah, I remember once sharing a house down in Plymouth with I think 7 of us, and we had 1 bathroom. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. But and you've got issues as well, I suppose, with parents being guarantors and things like that as well. That's
right. Yeah, with referencing as such, it's very difficult because you don't actually reference the tenant. It's the parent that's referenced as the guarantor.
Right. And you've obviously got that issue. You mentioned there like a 40-week tenancy. I remember from my uni days, you didn't want to pay for the thing while you're not in it in the summer or the holidays. So you take a hit on that, or how do you manage that?
It's quite interesting actually, because students' attitudes change the longer they spend at university. So you'll find that the first year students generally start looking for accommodation earlier, and then the fourth year, final year students will be thinking about potentially going to Ibiza for the summer and saving the money on the summer term.
Yeah, interesting stuff. We've just had a question come in while you were chatting there, just one popped up here. It comes from propertyadvice.co.uk, so thanks. Propertypriceadvice.co.uk, read it wrong. How can a landlord renting to students make the most of their property during the university holidays, which can sometimes be several months long? So I suppose the question there is, could you let it to somebody else or do something with it, or what would you do?
Of course, obviously, the landlord is able to do with his property what he so wishes, providing it's not under the agreement with the tenant as such. I really recommend to landlords that that's the time that you should look at your property, look at the maintenance of your property, make sure the hedges are trimmed, because at the end of the day that's what's going to make it most attractive to new potential tenants that will think about renting your property.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose it's fair to say as well, students could be great tenants as well. There's no kind of like thing that says you shouldn't ever rent to students because they're all layabouts to eat crisps.
Absolutely, and
they might be awesome.
Exactly. The stereotypical view of a student being from the young ones as such, I mean, it's quite funny because most students now don't know who the young ones are. Times really have changed, and students now, because of the rise in tuition fees, now £9,000, it's a tough time for students at the moment, so they're really thinking carefully about where they're going to university, picking the right universities and the right courses, and they're thinking very much about what they're going to get at the end of it vocationally. So they're really not at university to mess around, and it's interesting because students actually spend more time in the properties now as well.
Yeah, that's rather than going out to pubs, bars and clubs, they're kind of staying in. Yeah, it's quite interesting because I remember when I was at university, certainly all of my mates would come from all over the country, but I think now perhaps people go to universities nearer to home, and for the reason perhaps of accommodation costs, I don't know. Yeah,
it can vary. Obviously with the choice of university, that's the most important factor. So students are tending to still travel quite a bit, but it's obviously cost of accommodation is a very important key factor, and on our website, accommodationforstudents.com, we've got a rental table that helps landlords to decide where to buy student properties, etc.
Right, okay. And how do you go about, we were chatting before about referencing. I mean, how do you find the best student tenants really, and when should you start looking for them, I suppose?
I think the key important thing in terms of finding the right tenants is to basically meet as many as possible.
Right. Okay.
That's the best way of doing it. You know, don't just show tenants, potential tenants around a property and say, "Do you want it?" type thing.
Yeah.
Landlords really can afford to be quite choosy in terms of who they have to their properties. We've just opened up a calendar system on the website, so landlords can basically say, "I've got an open viewing on Saturday." And then students can all, at a click of a button, just sign up, register their interest, turn up within that 1 hour period, and then the landlord can then, take his pick essentially from the tenants.
Interesting.
There's a slightly different mindset as well for being a student landlord, because for most of the students, it's their first time away from home, so they don't have mum and dad picking up after them. They're not going to know how the washing machine works. They don't know how to change a light bulb. So I think if you're letting to students, don't expect your property necessarily to be returned in the pristine condition it was when you let it. Make sure you get a proper AST agreement, tenancy agreement, and as Simon said, meet them and go through what their obligations are. You know, you're not going to get a student out of bed to mow the lawn.
No, exactly.
So if that's what you want them to do, make sure that you tell them that's what you want them to do.
Or probably factor in the cost of a handyman to pop round once a month and do a few odd jobs.
And finally, check, a lot of insurers will not accept student tenants for some strange reason.
I was just going to say, differences for insurance companies. You mentioned insurance. So.
So make sure that when you're buying your insurance, if you are letting to students, make sure that you tell the insurance company or buy a policy that doesn't differentiate between the different tenant types.
Good stuff. All right, good advice. Another question's come in here, thanks to Helen Nathalin. She says, how can you allow students to decorate their bedrooms without blue or white tack marks, or worse, defacing the walls and resulting in the need for regular repainting? Cork boards can only do so much, and that's it.
They are going to put up timetables.
I remember that as a student. It's like, no posters on the walls, you can't do this, can't do that. But I mean, you've got to allow people to live in the property, haven't you, really?
That's right. It's general wear and tear as well within a property. It's to be expected with students. You know, if you don't want that, rent to professionals is probably my advice upon that. But we recently did a focus group with a lot of students around the UK, and we asked them what their ideal accommodation would be, and very much at the top of the list was making sure that you've got pin boards within the rooms, places where they can put things up. If you don't want that, maybe that's an option.
Yeah, sure. And specifically as well, like kind of what, if you are going to be letting to students, we mentioned just briefly different types of insurance. Are there any other sort of checks or anything else as a landlord you need to think about when you're letting to students?
Deposits. Make sure that you take a deposit, and that if you do take a deposit, that you actually protect it with a tenancy deposit protection scheme.
Right.
And the other type of insurance which is making quite a headway into the market is what's called home emergency insurance. And that's particularly useful if you are a landlord that has purchased a property miles away from where you actually live. And as I mentioned earlier, students are going to struggle with how do they turn the stopcock off, or what happens if they've got a broken window. And you don't want to be driving up and down the motorway trying to repair these sort of things. So you can buy a little policy that you can give the phone number to the tenant, and then they will ring the tradesman directly, and they will deal with those issues. And it's 24/7, so it stops you getting the phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, exactly.
I've locked myself out. What do I do?
Go and stay with a mate. Right, on that note, we'll move on, because it's time now then to have a look at your property tweets of the week, and I think Vanessa's going to help us with this one. So, Vanessa, thanks ever so much for sitting very quietly through all of that. But you're here now to do your...
It's all interesting stuff, isn't it?
It's great stuff.
Something.
Great stuff. And I think today's tweet of the week is to do with universal credit. I think we can see there on the screen, or you should be able to see on the screen at home, to do with universal credit. What's this one about then? Here it is. You can see it on the screen now.
Well, universal credit, very much on the minds of landlords at the moment. A lot of action on Twitter. I think we've got about 5 different discussions on universal credit happening on propertytribes.com.
Right.
It's coming, starting to be implemented from April 2013. And basically it's of concern to landlords because benefits will be paid to the recipient in a lump sum. And then it will be up to the benefit recipient to distribute those payments around, and I think a lot of landlords are quite fearful that the tenant is going to get this large lump of cash and is not going to pass on the rental payment. And I think there's always fear of the unknown, and it's not particularly clear about how it's going to be administered and how exactly it's going to work, and I think that's where the fear factor is coming in for landlords. But we have heard from government that they are going to employ common sense, and hopefully there will be direct payments to landlords, certainly for tenants in arrears if nothing else. But definitely, you know, things are changing, benefit caps are coming in as well, and the whole landscape of renting to LHA tenants is changing, and it may, you know, some landlords may feel that they don't want to remain in that marketplace and you know, move on to private tenants.
And the system that has been in place prior to this coming in, how long has that been in place for? Quite some time. It's
indeed,
like quite
yes.
historic.
It changes with different governments and so on, but one factor was that if a tenant went into arrears, we could have the benefit, the rent, paid direct to us as landlords.
Yeah, exactly.
And that gave it a feeling of comfort to the landlord.
What do you think on this one, Eddie? Because obviously you've been...
Well, I think listening to the whole show again today, not just on universal credit, but I think it shows that being a landlord now is not... it's not as easy as it once was. There seems to be so much legislation coming in and changes, and obviously universal credit is going to have a massive impact to many landlords. And if you've not read up on how it works, you could actually get quite stung for quite a severe amount of money. So my advice to would-be landlords out there is read up on your obligations and keep abreast of the legislation, as it seems to be changing almost monthly now, doesn't it?
Indeed. And I think, you know, many landlords say, well, I'm not going to rent to LHA tenants, I'm just going to focus on private tenants. But a private tenant is only one redundancy away from becoming an LHA tenant, and I've actually had that experience myself recently, where I had an extremely good tenant in a very good job who was made redundant very suddenly with no warning, and they've had to go on to benefits, and now I've got an LHA tenant. So I think it's very important to understand, as Eddie said, how the legislation is going to affect you, even if you think you're not going to ever end up with an LHA tenant, because in this marketplace you just don't know.
You just don't know, yeah. Great stuff. Well, thanks ever so much for that. We're nearly out of time, but we've had another question come in, so Phil, we'll get to your question. It says, what are the rules with regards to throwing students out if the neighbours complain? Is it possible to operate a one strike and you're out policy if the complaint is sufficiently bad? And what do you think of this one, Simon? You must have come across this.
Interesting question. I think the legal side of it is the answer is no. From that perspective, it's not. I think, again, it all comes down to what we were discussing beforehand. It's about choosing the right tenants for your property. And if you are in doubt about the tenant, you know, don't take them on in the first instance. But when these situations arise, obviously within a short hold tenancy agreements normally have stipulations on the number of people that can occupy a property, and what I would say is where you can put things into agreements and then follow it up in the right way with written notices.
As I said earlier, you've got to have a slightly different mindset. They're going to have parties and there's going to be a bit of noise, and I think a lot of it is about communication. You can't just turn up at a property as a landlord and demand, because it's your property, that you're just going to barge in. You've got to give notice. But I do recommend that you are at least inspecting the property on a semi-regular basis, and you're in a communication with the tenant.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's got to be a two-way street.
We've all been there, haven't we? And, you know,
probably worth noting as well that many councils have a noise officer who will, if you complain to the council, this person is on call 24/7.
Right, okay.
And if there's a very loud party going on, you can call the council, and this noise abuse guy will come out, and he will issue them a formal warning, and he will also contact the letting agent to let them know that the tenants have caused
last
problems.
resort would be to kick them out.
Last resort. But like I said, if you've got good communication, a good relationship before you start, you know, then hopefully you're all right.
One tip I've got for landlords is to sit down with the tenant at the start of the tenancy and discuss everything through, because just as much as you're judging the tenant's also judging you.
Of course.
So it's really important that you come across as being organised. You state, you know, what you're prepared to do in terms of SLAs, etc. And then also, you know, you can then have the opportunity to tell the tenants what you expect from them.
Yeah, good stuff. Right, one last quick question, because it's just come in. Another Phil, this time Phil Jones, says, what happens if a student leaves the university after only a few weeks? Can I hold them to the full contract length?
Well, yes,
I suppose legally you can.
Yes, you can, and I think if I could just expand that very quickly, a common problem with student lets is that many landlords issue what's called a joint and several tenancy agreement. So that's one agreement that covers all of the tenants that are in that property. And if one of those tenants leaves, then a lot of students don't understand that they are jointly liable for the balance of any of the rent. So yes, you can change tenants midway through, but if you don't manage to do that, you need to explain to the other tenants that they're going to be in for that rent which was being paid by the outgoing tenant.
And if they know that, that'll probably soon get them filling the gap, I'm sure, with somebody that they know.
Exactly, exactly.
Right. We're finding as well that there's individual tenancy agreements that are being produced now because students don't like the fact that they become liable for other people within the property, especially when they might not know them at the start of the term.
Good stuff. Well, listen, it's been great. We're at the end of our time. We've chatted away there for 30 minutes. We could have chatted for 30 more. But thanks ever so much for joining us once again. So there we go. We have run out of time. Our thanks go to Eddie, Paul, Simon and Vanessa for joining us. And of course, thanks to you watching along wherever you are right now. And of course, if you want to find out more, please go, or indeed find out more about Total Landlord Insurance, go to www.totallandlordinsurance.co.uk. And as well, if you're on Facebook, check out the Total Landlord Facebook page and give them a like. And if you do that, then you may win a year's subscription to Property Investor News. Best of luck with that, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.